All right, my name is Kyle Langley. I work as a technical designer on Fortnite. I currently work on the Save the World side of Fortnite, so not the fun part, I guess. Yeah, so what today's talks about is getting used to the gameplay ability system that ships with Unreal Engine 4. Sadly, it's one of the least documented, but probably the most powerful thing that we have for making video games in Unreal Engine. We use it extensively throughout products at Epic. Fortnite has its own version of it in a sense to where we have extended it, but at its base it's still the exact same system that I'll be showing off today. So just as an example, this is something I put together. This is about 6 hours of work. It's nothing too crazy. I'm using one of the Paragon heroes. So effectively what a gameplay ability system is used for is the action and reaction of anything in the game world. So if you have any sort of dynamic system in a world, which is weapons, projectiles, characters, etc., you can use the gameplay ability system to interact with all of these other dynamic objects and be able to make a game out of it. So this is going to be actually kind of like the technical sense of like, what do I do when I get the engine and how do I actually get this thing set up? The first step is in the engine itself, we have our plugins, or sometimes called modules. And we have gameplay abilities. The reason it's marked as unsupported is because it is experimental, meaning that we add to it, we change it, we have a lot of because we use it for our games, we don't want it to get locked down in the sense of not being able to update it for our games and then have the users not get that update because we did something maybe a little bit drastic. That means if you do start to use this, you should probably only use it for the one engine version that you are in, and probably not start merging other engine versions with your project unless you feel very comfortable doing so, because things could have changed. Part of this, we also need the gameplay tags editor, because gameplay tags are a huge facet of the gameplay ability stuff, and I'll get into why in a bit. So I'm not sure how familiar all of you are with Unreal setup, but for every project that you make, mine's called Robo, you have a source folder, and then part of that is having this build CS. And effectively all this does is it says, what modules do I want to load with my game? We need to have gameplay tags. We need to have all of the gameplay ability stuff. And here I have this for UI. If at any point you need to look any of this up, there is an example project on GitHub. You would need to look up Dave Ratty and look up gameplay ability system. Yeah. And this is pretty much like the baseline source code that you would need to get things started, and it has comments, it has a little bit more documentation than I'd be able to give you in the hour or 90 minutes or whatever that's going to be for this. This is more going to be like, when I have it, how do I start using it? How do I start making the dynamic bits happen in your game? So for any dynamic actor, you will need to have a gameplay ability or a gameplay system component or ability system component, which means you need to add a interface to that. So the interface is real simple. This is the ability system interface. And it's literally just the one function here as an interface. This just allows you to just to make sure, like, if you are using the ability system, that it makes sure that you have this component. Otherwise, you won't be able to use it. So once you implement that, you'll have your ability system component, and then that virtual that you need to override is going to return that out. And this just allows any of the dynamic actors to actually talk to each other. Because as soon as you have a reference to the ability system component, you're able to do all of the dynamic stuff. And in those dynamic things, so the abilities are designed for networked gameplay. They work for single player. There's absolutely no stop to use it in a single player game, but they were designed for multiplayer in mind, which means that there's a certain sort of structure to them specific to the replication process and sort of what should exist on the server, what doesn't exist on the server, and what only exists on the client. So in the game I was just playing, I was able to shoot projectiles. I have a GA here. This is a gameplay ability. This is the root of all of the gameplay ability system. The GA is going to be able to respond to things like input from the player. It's going to be able to respond to things like a gameplay tag being assigned to a player. And then it is able to then apply what's called a gameplay effect to anything or anybody that has an associated gameplay ability. That means you're able to do things like shoot a projectile, hit an enemy, apply a GE that maybe does damage to them. Maybe it knocks them back. Maybe you have some other thing set up to where the GE can sit on them and there's a dot or a healing thing or anything else. It's an incredibly powerful thing. There's also things where you can apply a GE to somebody that also calls another GA, which means you have this infinite list of things that you could potentially do based on the reaction of any one other thing. So the cool thing about the ability system is that it's completely exposed to Blueprint. So everybody who's scared of C++, or maybe just necessarily doesn't want to spend all of their time in C++, you can actually get this system set up, implemented, and then do the vast majority of your work in Blueprint. Most of Fortnite's abilities, I would say more than 95% of Fortnite's abilities are done in Blueprint. There is very specific rules that we have when using them, such as like don't use tick if avoidable, don't do any sort of heavy math, general sort of Blueprint concepts to where it's a scripting language. It's going to be just inherently slow, so if you're doing inherently slow things, it will just be slower. So it's just one of those things to keep in mind as you're going. The root of the gameplay abilities, I have just a base class here called Grim Base, GA Grim Base. So there's two major facets to the gameplay ability system in terms of the gameplay system or the ability system component attached to the pawn, to where it has two references. It has a reference to the pawn that it's on, and it has a reference to the controller that it is on. This here, get avatar actor from actor info, is actually the pawn. Now the reason it's an actor class is because it doesn't necessarily have to be a pawn that is associated with the system. It could be a door, it could be a pickup, it could be any sort of interactable thing that you may deem necessary to have the ability system component on it. And for any ability there, you can just get the actor reference and then cast into the thing that you may need to get the reference out of. In this case, it's our robo character Grim here, and I just keep a reference to it. So in any sort of child class, I'm able to just call get Grim here, and it just does that function for me, to where I can get the avatar actor, I cast it into the character, and then I have a reference to anything that I need from that character. So the power shot thing we have here, we have a montage to play. This is the shooting montage. These, I don't know if anybody's worked with these sort of timed functions before, but they're latent functions, meaning each one of these is going to happen at some time after the initial call. So on completed will be when the montage has finished playing. There's also blend out, interrupted, or canceled. In our case here, we actually don't really care if any of those things happen because we still want the projectile to play even if the animation has been canceled. Potentially you could do something like on canceled, you actually just end the ability and ignore everything else. But in our case, that's probably not a great idea. So we play the montage, we spawn an ability projectile. This is actually a function that I wrote myself because I needed it to be associated with the gameplay ability system. So it's a very straightforward function to where I just have an instigator, I have a template, and then I have wherever I want to spawn it, which is instigator, the template of the projectile I want to spawn, and then where it is going to be spawned in the world. Transforms are going to hold a location, a rotation, and a scale. So as long as the instigator of the projectile is valid, we have projectile template, and there's an authority figure to the template, meaning this is the server, or if you're in single player, it just means you have authority over everything. We just spawn the projectile, and then from that we're able to put an instigator and then spawn location to the projectile. The little icon here, this means that it's specific to the server side. And then after projectile spawns, there is gameplay queues. So the gameplay queues are the other side of the network bit to the gameplay abilities. Queues are designed to be sent to all of the clients in the game, and they are specific to things like sound and effects and anything you want specific to happen on the client side. And again, you do this by sending a tag over, which is the gameplay queue tag here. Part of sending gameplay queues is you can also send these parameters along with it. This is sort of a generic template of things that you can send. In our case, we only care about who's sending it, so on the other end we can do something based on that. And because this actor is replicated, that means the client-side version will have a valid reference to it. If you send something through here that's not a valid, if it's not replicated, the other client won't get it and the instigator will be null. And that's not used. So even though that's a little long-winded, when you get used to the sort of the structure blueprint and the pace at which you can work at, this is a very quick function. There's nothing about this ability that's necessarily challenging, but it's completely set up for a multiplayer video game with no overhead in regards to deciding an RPC event or any sort of broadcast or anything else that you might have to experience with another language or another engine. The main reason for that is because gameplay abilities themselves are replicated. So when these things get called, you can sort of decide if it happens on the server or if it happens on any of the clients. In this case, we have a replication policy of do not replicate, and that means that this thing will not replicate down, but because it's locally predicted, that means that there will be one for the client and one for the server, but there won't be any update from the server on the client, which means you sort of have to be careful if you're doing something in here. Like for instance, the server's not necessarily going to care about this, but the client will, but it's not going to hurt the server to call this because the server doesn't play animations anyway, generally. In the case of this, because it's marked behind a server flag and it's only going to happen on the server, you don't have to worry about it. And then executing this on the client isn't going to do anything because it's a server function as well. So in this case, these settings make sense. If you did want us to replicate, you could do something where you replicate here and then have a client side to do something that you want from this point, such as play sound or effects if you wanted to say ignore the gameplay cues. So with that, that's the power shot where the projectile spawns. And I'll show you the projectile. There's nothing special about the projectile. It'd be set up in any other way if you're using a different system for your weapons. If anybody's used the projectile stuff before in Unreal, it's real simple. You just have an actor, you have a projectile movement component, and that's literally it. All you have to do is just pass in the speeds and whatever sort of variance you want in the projectile. In this case, it moves at 1800. It can only ever move at 1800, and these are going to be centimeters per second, I believe. And then there's a gravity scale of 0.7, meaning it's going to react to the world at 0.7 of the normal gravity scale. And then part of the reason of having that function that I made is because of the ability system component here, because I need a reference to it. So I can then apply anything I need to to anybody this hits. So when this projectile hits something, there's a GE here. So this is what I was talking about earlier. These are sort of like the buff or debuff concept, where I want to apply something to somebody for some reason. It can happen immediately, it can happen over time, or it can happen forever. In this case, we just want to do damage. So this is a very simple one. All gameplay effects have modifiers, meaning that you can modify an attribute such as health for run speed, or armor durability, or anything else that happens to exist as an attribute on the pawn. Executions are a little more complicated, to where in this case we want a damage execution. Attack power is the code term here for damage. It's the amount of power which you attack with. And I simply override that value. There's a lot of options here. You can add to a current value, you can multiply a value, you can divide from that value, or you can flat out override it. So this means, like, for instance, you can get a pickup that's applied to a player for, let's say, 30 seconds. You can multiply their damage by 2, and that'll exist for 30 seconds. And so, like, has duration, will have a duration, and you could do something like this to mean this will exist on them for 30 seconds, and there will be an override. And this is the execution is an application of something. The modifier is going to actually manipulate stats, such as attack power, or health, or anything else. So when you get to having gameplay abilities and having gameplay effects, and then you start mentioning things like attributes or executions, it means that you can do a whole bunch of very unique things. And this is probably the heaviest chunk that you would have to get through in terms of the programming side of things. But once it's set up, it's set up, and you don't really have to go back into it. The damage execution class is just this gameplay effect execution calculation, and it has this implementation that can be overwritten, and so you can change what you need to. Now, sadly, this is one of those things that is just a lot to take in, and no matter how well I explain it or how often I explain it, this kind of thing is like, at least when I started on Fortnite, this is about a 3-month overhead of learning. It's about a 3-month learning curve. The simplest way I can explain it is that through these parameters, you are going to get whatever these attributes are, and all of these attributes are going to be tied to gameplay effects that exist on the target ability component. We could have something in here to where if there's an attribute on the player taking damage, we could potentially say that that attribute halves the damage, or maybe they're vulnerable, so it multiplies to that damage. This parameter is going to hold all of that information, and there's a huge amount of context to this, and there's not one example I can give you in which it makes perfect sense. Effectively, you're getting the information you need from the player that you're executing this on in order to correctly represent whatever that execution is. So in our case here, we're going to have a health value and we're going to have an attack power value, and between two of these, we are going to be able to manipulate the health of this thing by the attack power applied to it. And that's what happens here. When you do the add output modifier, this is actually going to directly manipulate the health property as an additive value by passing in a negative. And that's a little nonsensical for somebody who doesn't program, but because subtracting from an add is still a subtract, it works. But this is it for the damage right here. Is it simply just taking in any of these tags? It evaluates the health definition, the attack power definition through the evaluation parameters, such as I have a tag on the source target that's multiplying damage, or I have a tag on the target that is reducing damage. These values would then be able to be manipulated based on those things through this calculation, through the attribute magnitude. And magnitude is just the term for how much is this thing doing, or how much is this thing changing. So what is my health value? What is my attack power? That is the magnitude. So attributes, these are the ability sets, hold on. So the attribute set is literally just called view attribute set, and this comes with the ability system as well. If you haven't worked with C++ and Unreal, view properties are essentially a way to tie whatever it is you're doing to either the garbage collection process, which is what view properties do, or expose it to Blueprint, which is what the Blueprint read only will do. Meaning that you can have a Blueprint version of the attribute set, and all of these values will then show up in that attribute set if you need it. Replicated using is a way to say that I want to replicate this, but I want to replicate it on a notify, meaning that when something replicates, the client side of that is going to get a notify that it has changed, and they're going to be able to do anything they want from that event. So you could, replicate health value, and then from that be able to send an event that health changed, and then be able to do something like play a particle system or sound or whatever else. These three overrides are part of the attribute system, to where when an attribute base has changed, before it has changed, and after it has changed. This is the base value change, this is the actual attribute value change, and then this is a gameplay effect after it has executed. Default health value is going to be 100 for both max and their health. This is a completely arbitrary thing. It's hard-coded. This could be part of a system that's actually created to where you have classes that maybe have a scaling health factor or something, to where it might not be so easy as just setting it in the constructor of the class. So this is literally just managing the attribute stuff. I mean, there's nothing too complicated. Before the base change, you just clamp the value to whatever the max health value is, or between 0 and the max health value. So that way, when you change your health value, you make sure that you're never going to go out of bounds of that value, because realistically, you don't want it to be a negative, and you never want it to be more than maximum. Okay. So the post gameplay effect execute here, we're going to get targeting, and we're going to get our source actors. These are the things that either are the target actor or the source actor if that's doing the damage or manipulating the health attribute. And again, we just clamp health to 0. If it's less than, this is probably could just be this. And we have a character. This is where we would actually call die on the character because their health happened to be 0. And this is like the bridge between where the ability system meets the general gameplay code kind of idea, to where we have this entire subsystem of things happening in the gameplay ability stuff where we're manipulating attributes and we're applying effects and we have things that are going on, but we still need to have that side of the game that is sort of the generic gameplay programming sense of stuff, to where we need to let the game mode know of something that's happened, or the character know that something has happened outside of the ability stuff. And in this case, we need to make sure that the character that actually has its health changed to less than 0 or 0 is going to die. And again, this comes down to just really generic sort of gameplay stuff, to where as long as we have an active world we're in, we're going to send in who died, by who did the damage to it, and then who's actually dying, and then what effect has actually been applied to that, or what effect is the result of that person dying. And that could be something like the projectile damage or a dot or anything, and this just allows you to sort of have things like, let's say you had an event system, players killed by blah blah blah's fire gun, or whatever sort of thing that you could potentially do. You could have that information inside the spec here. And then, let's see, play dying. This just sort of destroys the pawn and then removes it from the server. And then these are just actually removing the health values and whatever else from the attribute set that exists on the character. So with all of that said, this is like a hefty amount of stuff to go through. The problem is I found is that even with that, a little bit of direction, if you decide to start working at it, that's generally enough to start figuring out some of these bigger problems on your own. And to break it down just simply one more time, let's see if there's a notepad. We have gameplay, we have the ability system component. This is the any actor. Is that font readable? Sort of, maybe? Yeah, if I can figure that out. That's it. So if anybody has an ability system component, that system component manages these things. And then any actor that has the component also holds the attributes, such as health, shielding, energy, whatever else you want it to be. But realistically, this is as basic as it gets. The problem is that the system supports so many different things in so many different contexts that you can get really overloaded with the sort of construct of it, especially when you start working in a multiplayer game. I would recommend that anybody who starts at this probably doesn't worry about the multiplayer side of things at first, and then maybe starts to extend into that at a later point, especially because just learning networking on its own is just a whole other feat of knowledge that you need. So the pawn that we have that exists, let's find them. This is just a normal character that ships with Unreal Engine 4. There's nothing crazy about it. There's just a simple event here to change the color of it when it spawns in as a certain team. Here, Team 1 or Team 2. But it has its ability system component, and then inside of here, you're going to have this default ability set, and this is going to be the default abilities that get applied to the hero or the character when he gets created. And that's just done through a few lines of code in the character class. Yeah, that'd be done. So we have an ability set here, and as long as we're the server, we're the authority, that default ability set is going to give abilities to our ability system component, and our ability set does that through here. Now, one of the cool things about the ability stuff is that it is tied into the input system, meaning that I could press a key and that key could react to that ability. And in this case, we're doing that based on as long as the bind info, as long as the ability that's being used, that's going to get applied, has a command that's not just the end value. We're also going to assign a key to it, and that's the command here. We could also have abilities that just listen for events, or maybe they're passive, or they're not tied to any sort of input. And you literally just omit the last two things here from that, and it still gives the ability out and can react to anything. The setup for input is exactly the same as any other tutorial you're going to find. These are just the general movement ones. And then for the ability system component, we want to bind the component to we want to bind the input component to the ability component. And then as we loop through this array, we're just going to apply those binds to that the ability component, meaning that any one of those binds could be used for any one ability. And it's really easy to just have an enum. In this case, I just have this ability input binds. And this is real simple to add to. You literally would just add whatever you wanted. Now I'd have to recompile to show you that it's there. So for the sake of not having to do that, how you actually introduce these things to the input, like the input binds, is through these display names. So I'll show you in the editor. The editor is going to have its project settings, and then in here we're going to have an input. And then these are all going to be actions. So ability 1, ability 3, reload, ability 2, etc. And then these are what reacts to those things. So if I open up the ability set, I can show you how that's connected. So in this case here, ability 1 is actually jump, ability 2 is dash, ability 3 is the power shot, the projectile, and then I also have an ability for knockback specifically, so when you shoot somebody they actually get knocked back, and that again is just driven through an ability that gets applied to that person when they get hit by the projectile. Which is why it's just set to max. There is no input key for this, but they still need to have the ability to fire the ability, meaning that if you create abilities and they're not firing, it's probably because they're not associated in any way with that ability system component. So let's see, like as a quick example to show like in some way how you go about creating an ability, we can just recreate the jump one, because there actually is a jump one as an example. So one thing about making abilities is if you call an activate ability and you never call the end ability, that ability will run forever. It is very important that if you have this, at some point you also have this. And if you don't, it will cause pretty big problems with whatever you're doing. A lot of the bugs that we have on Fortnite actually come down to somebody forgetting to either call this or having a path through something that doesn't actually get to this. So if you ever seen a bug where like, I can't switch to weapons, it's probably because another ability is running and blocking the action to switch to weapons because the ability is running, another one's running. So in this case, we just made this one very simple. Characters already have a jump function. There's no need to like add velocity to anything. So you just call that and then in the ability. And then if we go back to here, we can reset or change this one to, where did jump go? There it is. So we'll change from the gameplay ability default one to our new Grim one. It's still ability one. And we still have our jump. Now we could also do, other fun things with this as well, to where we get rid of the default jump. Oops. So instead of relying on whatever the default jump was, we could actually just create our own as an impulse. I don't actually know what the default jump value is. Probably, I mean, we make this real high. I'll probably rocket off into space for this one. Right. So these aren't limited to any one thing that you want to do. They're very flexible. They're completely tied into the gameplay framework of the engine. You have references to all of the major classes you may need, including, characters, their components. Their components have things like, whatever impulse or whatever it is else. So it's not, the ability system itself is not limited in any concept other than actually just learning how the abilities themselves are set up and used. So with all of that said, I'm sure it's a lot to take in, but is there questions?